Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. We're continuing our study in the Gospel of Mark, and we are in Mark chapter 7. Previously, we had read in Mark chapter 7 about a confrontation that Jesus has with some Pharisees and scribes who had made a special trip from Jerusalem up to the northern country of Galilee to meet with him, actually to accuse him of breaking the rules of their traditions, and Jesus deals with them handily. And then he tells his disciples kind of a shortened parable, but they didn't understand it. In verses 17 and 18 of Mark chapter 7, we see where Jesus has to explain his meaning to them, and he asks them, "Are you so lacking in understanding also that you do not understand that whatever goes into the heart of man from outside cannot defile him?" So Jesus has to go into quite a bit of explanation to his disciples. And of course, it wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. But in our lesson today, we're going to see Jesus come across someone else, a Gentile woman no less, who gets him, who understands him. And sometimes, though, like the disciples, we find ourselves a little slow, I guess, to get what Jesus means. We're going to see him later on in this same lesson today. We're going to see Jesus heal a man who was deaf and mostly mute. And I can't help but think that perhaps Jesus does these healings to help us, to see that sometimes we can be deaf sometimes to what he speaks. We need to have our ears and minds and hearts open to what Jesus has to say. And the whole thing just shows us how Jesus has the power to completely transform people. So let's talk about it. Let's look at what is going on in Mark chapter 7. In verse 24, it says that Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. Now, Jesus had been in the area of Gennesaret, which is, right around this area here, right around here where the word Galilee is. It's around that area there. So Jesus is in this area around the Sea of Galilee, but then he goes up to the far north to Matthew tells us the region of Tyre and Sidon. Mark only mentions Tyre here. Now, this area was about 50 miles north of where Jesus was. And it's in an area that was originally given to the tribe of Asher as their inheritance. But when you read through the book of Judges, you see where so much of the land that was given to the Israelites wasn't completely conquered. The people there were idolatrous, and they were condemned by the prophets. A couple of notable places is Isaiah 23 and Ezekiel chapters 27 and 28. And so because of the inhabitants, this would have been an unclean area for the Jews. They were Gentiles. And of course, you know how Jews felt about non-Jews. Everything that they touched was unclean because they were an unclean people. But Jesus heads to this unclean area. And it's interesting for me, at least to note that in verse 24, it says that he wanted no one to know of it. And perhaps Jesus was going to get some rest. You recall a couple of lessons prior, Jesus had intended for his disciples to rest, but they couldn't get any. So many people were coming to them. Well, maybe now Jesus is intending to get the rest that he hadn't been able to get before. But it says that he could not escape notice. And of course, wherever Jesus goes, people throng about him. They know that he's a miracle man, and they want to be healed, and they want to know if there's something that he can do for them. Well, Jesus does something for many, Matthew tells us, and we may be going to Matthew's account of this in Matthew chapter 15 while we flip back and forth between Matthew 15 and Mark 7. But there's a woman who comes to Jesus, and she has the cry of the hurting to give him. In verse 25 it says, "After hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, this woman approaches Jesus, and she keeps asking him. Now, it seems a little mild, because Matthew tells us in Matthew 15, verse 22, that she cried out. In fact, it was so annoying to the disciples that they asked Jesus, in Matthew's account, to send her away. The idea is that she just didn't come and make a simple, quiet request. She was pleading with Jesus. She kept asking him. The language indicates that there's this repeated action that's going on here. She keeps asking. She keeps crying out. Obviously, she's in great distress over her situation, and she appeals to the only one who she believes can help. And Mark, as well as Matthew, make sure that we know that she's not a Jew. She's a Gentile of the Syro-Phoenician race. She's somebody who is outside that scope of who the Jews believed the Messiah would come. The emphasis on her non-Jewishness helps us, as well as the fact that she's a woman, I really believe helps us to see, especially as we go on with this incident, how Jesus came to level the playing field, how he came to call all people to himself, just as the prophecies foretelling of the Messiah indicate, no matter how much the Jews wanted to forget those parts of the prophecies. Well, she comes to Jesus and she keeps asking. And that it says in Matthew chapter 15 that she falls at Jesus' feet. Here, it tells us that she was willing to do whatever it took to come to Jesus. Matthew uses a word, though, that is often translated worshiped. In fact, that's how the King James Version translates it. She came and she worshiped at Jesus' feet. That goes in line with the way that she addresses Jesus. Matthew says she calls him Son of David. Here, later on, she calls him Lord in verse 28 of Mark 7. This might indicate that the expectation of a Messiah, of a Jewish deliverer, had spread to non-Jewish places like Tyre and Sidon, to the Gentiles. And perhaps even more than that, that the Gentiles would be able to share in the blessings of the Son of David, or the Lord, or the coming Christ, the Messiah. The area that she lived in was the same area that centuries before God had sent the prophet Elijah to, in order to be cared for by a widow. That's in 1 Kings chapter 17. And in fact, in Luke chapter 4, Jesus brings up that incident. Let's turn there for a moment. Luke chapter 4. In Luke 4, and in verse 25, in Jesus' hometown of Nazareth, he talks about this very thing. Jesus said, I say to you in truth, that there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, when a great famine came over all the land, and yet Elijah was sent to none of them. To who? To the widows in Israel, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And then later on in verse 28, it says that when the people in the synagogue heard these things, they were filled with rage. And I can't help but think that it's implied to us that because Jesus brought up the fact that God desires to help non-Jews, and he even sent their premier prophet Elijah to that area, that they just didn't like that. This woman back in Mark chapter 7, this Gentile woman who keeps asking Jesus, who falls at his feet in worship, who recognizes him as the Son of David, as the Messiah, when even his closest disciples weren't quite there yet, appeals to him on behalf of her daughter. She has a demon, and of course any mother would do whatever they could to deliver their child from the cruel things that a demon-possessed child would be put through. Well, she has confidence that her cries will be heard. And in verse 27 of Mark 7, Jesus said to her, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs." Stop there for a moment. Jesus replies with kind of a metaphor. He mentions that the children, the Jews, must be satisfied first. In fact, in Matthew's account, in Matthew 15 and verse 24, Jesus says that I was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But he doesn't say only, at least he doesn't here. He says that the children should be satisfied first. Now, there's an indication certainly that God's plan of salvation would be to the Jews first. And Jesus even told that to a woman in Samaria. In John chapter 4, verse 22, he says plainly, salvation is from the Jews. Salvation, it doesn't mean that the Jews are saviors, but that salvation would begin with the Jews. And that's exactly what Scripture tells us. But it doesn't preclude Gentiles from sharing in the blessings of salvation. In fact, Jesus, just before he ascended into heaven, reminded his disciples that the prophets foretold that the Christ would come and that repentance for forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. And when we go through especially the writings of Paul, we see this reiterated again and again and again and again. In Romans 1 verse 16, Paul affirms that the gospel is the power of God to salvation. He says, for the Jew first, and also to the Greek, to the Jew and to the non-Jew. Romans chapters 9 through 11 are just full of that argument for Paul, where he talks about the fact that God had always intended to save the Israelites. Well, here in Mark chapter 7, Jesus says that the children need to be satisfied first, but it's not good, he said in verse 27, to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Whoa, that's kind of harsh, right? There are a couple of terms for dogs in the New Testament. One is a harsh, derogatory word for the scavenging type of dog, the wild dog. That's the kind of thinking that Jews had for non-Jews, and especially for those who were half-Jews, half-breeds, the Samaritans. They considered them dogs, scavengers, not entitled to the blessings of the God of Israel. But Jesus uses a word here that softens it somewhat. It's a word for a domesticated dog, a pet. And the woman that Jesus speaks to uses a variation of that word that might even mean puppy. She says in verse 28, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs." Some people see this as a playful banter between Jesus and the woman. But it's hard to see it that way, because the woman wasn't being playful. She is pleading for help for her daughter. And she seizes this opportunity to tell Jesus that even the crumbs of what he had would benefit her. You recall before when we were reading about the healings, some healings that Jesus does, that people were coming to Jesus and they were taking the very minimum from him. In fact, if you look with me in chapter 6 of Mark, in verse 56, it says, whenever he entered villages or cities or the countryside, they were laying the sick in the marketplaces and imploring him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak. And as many as touched it were being cured. Now, there's an indication for us that this woman understood that. She just needed a little bit from Jesus, that it would be enough for her. One guy put it this way. He said, she was willing for Jesus to give the Jews what he would, but she desired that he deny her not this mercy. Out of his abundance, it was only a crumb. And they, meaning the Jews, would not be the poorer by his giving her this crumb. But she would be immeasurably richer. And of course, there's all kinds of scriptures, especially in the Proverbs, that remind us that even just a bit that we get from the Lord is better than all the abundance we can get from the wicked. One of those is Proverbs 37, verse 16, that says, "Better is the little of the righteous than the abundance of many wicked." This woman gets it. This woman sees how it just takes a little bit from Jesus, and that's all I need. Well, let's read about what Jesus does for her. Let's read about the comfort of this woman who is helped. In verse 29, Jesus said to her, "Because of this answer," and I can't help but think that Jesus marveled at her. In fact, Matthew tells us he does. "Because of this answer, go. The demon has gone out of your daughter." And going back to her home, she found the child laying on the bed, the demon having left. In Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 28, Jesus says, "O woman, your faith is great." Here, he acknowledges her answer when she says, "Yes, Lord, but I just need a little bit. Even the dogs under the table can get enough by feeding on your crumbs." Jesus sees the faith of this woman, the utter trust and belief that she has in him, that whatever he says will happen. And again, Jesus has opportunity to marvel, just as he has before, at the faith of a non-Jew, at the faith of a Gentile. And this woman had shown more insight into the blessings and the true deliverance that Jesus came to bring than many of those who had been following him for quite some time. Mark makes the point again and again, and we've noticed this in our Bible class here at Eastside, that despite Jesus' unparalleled preaching and the deeds that he performed, unbelief was the order of the day. When it comes to faith, it seems that Jesus is surrounded by incompetence. His family thought he was crazy. His hometown rejected him. His disciples, Peter especially, sunk like a rock at his lack of faith on the lake of Galilee. The religious establishment was entrenched in infidelity and unfaithfulness. And Jesus has to remind those who already had been with him for some time that they were still of little faith. And yet this woman, this Gentile woman no less, gets it. And Jesus makes that proclamation in Matthew, "O woman, your faith is great." And so for her faith, for her trust and belief and utter confidence in Jesus, he pronounces the blessing. "The demon has gone out of your daughter." And I've no doubt that as she went back home, she expected the scene that she saw. Look again at verse 30. Going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left. She gets home, she finds her daughter lying in bed, resting, and best of all, cured. It may be significant, I think, that this event occurs between two great feedings, the feeding of the 5,000 and coming up in chapter 8, the feeding of the 4,000. Many, many, many fed by the abundance of Jesus. And here's another feeding of a different type. This woman who has the opportunity to get just the crumbs, as she puts it, from Jesus, and it's more than enough for her and for her daughter. We see here as we continue, verse 31, or later on, we're told that Jesus, in verse 37, will do all things well. And that's something that maybe takes us back to Genesis chapter 1, where it tells us that Jesus, or rather God himself, Jesus, we're told, was the agent of creation. But when God had created the heavens and the earth, says he looked and it was good, it was very good. This is that same kind of language that we see later on in verse 37, where people are going to marvel at the incident we're going to look at in just a moment. It says he makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Those are shadows to us from Isaiah chapter 35. Isaiah 35 is a very messianic chapter that speaks of what the Messiah would do when he would come, the healing that he would be able to instigate, the power that he would have. And all of this is pointing to the identity of Jesus. There's another incident here, this healing by the sea that Jesus is going to effect here in Mark 7, beginning in verse 31. Let's go ahead and read all of those verses. Mark 7, 31 through 37. It says, again, he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of the Decapolis. Now, let's just for a moment mark where Jesus was and then now where he goes. Jesus is covering a lot of territory. Earlier we saw him here in the area of the region of Gennesaret, and he headed up north to Tyre and Sidon, and now we see Jesus heading southeast to the area of the Decapolis, the 10 cities. This is an area that had some previous contact with Jesus. Back in Mark chapter 5, Jesus heals some demon-ridden people. One man in particular who had so many demons in him, they called themselves Legion because they were many, right? Well, back then, if you recall, these people had begged Jesus to leave the area. But now, something completely different is going on. Let's keep reading. In verse 32, it says, they brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay his hands on him. Now let's just stop there for a moment, and let's make a quick left to Matthew chapter 15. In Matthew chapter 15, we see here a prominent problem that Matthew lays out for us. In Matthew 15 and in verse 30, Matthew says that large crowds came to him, bringing with them those who were lame, crippled, blind, mute, and many others, and they laid them down at his feet, and he healed them. So Matthew lays out for us this general healing that Jesus does among many. But did you notice back in Mark? Mark zeroes in and focuses on one guy. Verse 32 of Mark 7. They brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay his hands on him. Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva, and looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said to him, Ephphatha, be opened. And his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave them orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered it, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. They were utterly astonished, saying, he's done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Let's consider this private healing that Jesus does for a moment. As I said before, Matthew records for us the healing of many people in a very general way. But here, Mark singles out the healing of one particular man in detail. The man was deaf, and it says that he could only speak with difficulty, which maybe indicates to us that he had learned to speak maybe before he had lost his hearing. We had seen, if you've read through the Gospel of John, particularly in John chapter 5, Jesus asks a man there, do you want to be made well? Well, this guy couldn't hear Jesus, even if Jesus would have asked the question. But of course, Jesus doesn't have to ask. He would know what this man wanted. He could neither speak well nor hear at all. And so Jesus does what seems to us something strange. He he in verse 33, he put his fingers into the man's ears, and he spits and then touches his tongue with the saliva. Now, it's not told to us why or even where Jesus spit, whether he spit on his fingers and touches his tongue or what. But think about that. The ears and the tongue, these were the areas of problem for this guy. And so by doing what he does, maybe Jesus is indicating the impending healing of the organs that had lost their proper function. God intends for us to function in the way that he had created us to. And then with this groan, this sigh, in fact, Mark calls it in verse 34, a deep sigh. He says a word that's either Hebrew or Aramaic, ephphatha, that is, be opened. Mark translates it for us so that we know what Jesus is saying. Not only were his ears opened, but his tongue was loosed. It's interesting to me to note this deep sigh of Jesus. It doesn't tell us what the emotion was that prompted the sigh. Mark does that a lot. He tells us about what Jesus is feeling. Here he simply tells us what Jesus does. He breathes out this deep sigh. Matthew tells us it's a groan. And maybe Jesus groaned because of the miseries of human life that are always before him. People were always bringing him those who were sick or demon-possessed or in some way suffering. Jesus saw an abundance of suffering in his life on earth. And if so, then it points out to us poignantly his empathy with man. Let's look for just a moment at Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2. There are many places that we're told the ways in which Jesus empathizes with us. He sympathizes and empathizes with his creation. But in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 9, it says, we see him, meaning Christ, who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. You see what the Hebrew writer is telling us here? Jesus identifies with us in the most fundamental ways. Later on in Hebrews 2 and in verse 14, the Hebrew writer says, therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. In verse 18, it says, for since he himself was tempted in that which he has suffered, he is able to come to the aid of those who were tempted. Jesus here in Mark chapter 7 is a living, walking parable of what he himself had come to do. And of course, after this, Jesus tells them not to tell anybody, but of course they can't keep from telling everybody. In verses 36 and 37, although he said don't tell anybody, he says the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. And again, notice what it says there in verse 37. He has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Of course, the people are amazed at what Jesus has done. And as they witness the scripture that had been foretold, as we made some reference to Isaiah 35, they're moved to glorify God. That's what Matthew 15 verse 31 says. They glorified God. And how do they glorify God? By realizing the identity of Jesus. And of course, they're just completely unable to contain this news. Before they had begged him to leave, now they can't wait to tell everybody about who he is and what he can do because of what he'd done for them. Well, thanks for joining us as we looked at 2 cases of faith to heal and Jesus' immense power to do just that. I hope you'll join us again as we continue our study in Mark. Thanks for joining us. God bless you.